the trend of Russia is to become a vassal state of China, effectively, both economically and politically, which is deeply unpopular amongst the Russian people for whatever reason. And military dependency on the likes of North Korea and Iran. I mean, this is not where your average Russian, even not particularly well-educated Russian, wants the country to be. Most Russians still want the country to be a European power and to have significant relationships with Europe, both economic and social, cultural.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're talking to a former intelligence officer with Britain's secret intelligence service, MI6. Chris Steele ran the Russia desk until his retirement in 2009 when he co-founded Orbis Business Intelligence. He famously became known for the controversial so-called Steele dossier, or the Trump-Russia dossier compiled in the run-up to the 2016 US presidential elections. Chris Steele, welcome to Frontline. Good to have you here. What was your reaction when you learned that Britain is expelling Russia's defence attaché?
I was relieved in a sense, because I think there's evidence that Russia is conducting the sort of operations that a country does when it's at war with another country within Britain and other European states. And I think that it was high time that we took some fairly drastic action to combat this.
The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, says he was an undeclared military intelligence officer. I mean, that in itself is not entirely a shock, because you expect defence attachés to collect information. What was the risk exactly, do you think?
I suspect that the service to which this guy belonged, which is the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, is involved in planning and carrying out sabotage type operations, kinetic operations, as we call them, both in the UK and in Europe, in our allies. And I suspect that he was removed precisely for that reason.
The move extends to removing diplomatic status from some properties and will limit the length of Russian visas. Malign activity was the phrase that James Cleverly was talking about. How effective a defence do you think these moves will be?
Difficult to say, because Russia has huge intelligence services and resources and assets around the place. I mean, clearly acts like this, cutting the head off the hydra, as it were, is a good thing to do. But of course, a lot of their operations are carried out by travelling people or agents under what we would call non-official cover. This is an official cover officer who's been removed, but probably someone who knew quite well what was going on in Britain and Britain itself, and was reconnaissing the country and so on. And therefore, worthwhile to stick a spanner in the works in this way, I think.
You said at the beginning of this interview that you were relieved. Can you just describe how you think Russia has been developing its espionage and intelligence gathering in the UK and in the West?
Well, I think the starting point for that has to be the fact that Russia, and the leaders of Russia at least, believe that they're at war, not just at war with Ukraine, but also at war with NATO. And of course, Britain is one of the strongest members of NATO and one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine. And therefore, we would be a very high priority target, both for espionage, gathering intelligence, but also disruption, which is what sabotage effectively comprises.
And you were on the Russia desk until 2009. During your time, the former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London, or just around the time of you starting on the Russia desk. How did you see the threat posed by Russia at that time?
I think if you go right back to the beginning of this Putin regime and the so-called Moscow apartment bombings, I don't know if you're aware of them, but these were explosions in housing blocks in Moscow and elsewhere, which killed up to 300 Russian civilians. And was blamed on Chechen terrorists, when in fact it looked very much like it was a provocation by the Russian security services themselves, which gave us, I think, a pretty clear idea of what sort of regime we were dealing with here. And I think we were in denial about it at governmental level for quite some time. And the reminder, I suppose, of Litvinenko case on our own soil should have really moved the dial. And I was there at the time, and I'm not sure it did practically. There were a lot of people who wanted to believe the best of Russia after the 1990s and the need to co-opt Russia onto a sort of anti-Islamist terrorist alliance. all of which played out in such a way that it gave Putin and others encouragement and breathing room, I think, to develop the sort of statecraft and the sort of policies that they are pursuing now.
And looking at this week's inauguration of President Putin for a fifth term and what he said at the Victory Day parade in Russia today, that Russia would do everything to avoid a clash of global powers, but would not let itself be threatened, that its strategic forces are always in a state of readiness, read into that nuclear capabilities. What does this tell us about his evolution as a leader since the fall of the Soviet Union?
I think he's probably more of an opportunist and more of a tactician than a strategist. I don't think when he set out in 2000, he would have envisaged being in the position he is in now, where Russia's turned away from Europe and turned towards Asia, strong alliance with China, military dependency on the likes of Iran and North Korea. So I don't think that was inevitable. And I think part of the blame for that, in a sense, lies at our feet, because we misread him and misread Russia over that period. And I think our deterrence effectively was dissipated. And if you look at, for example, Chancellor Merkel's approach to Russia over the years, which was engagement would lead to a better behaved, more civilized country, then that's now entirely discredited. And we see, I think, the old KGB officer who loved the fact that the Soviet Union was a superpower, that it was a respected and feared, effectively imperialist power, actually, on the Eurasian continent, coming back to the fore. And I think, there are several Putins, and we've seen a number of them over the years. What we're seeing now is a very much retro one from his days in the KGB.
And when you were in Moscow between 1990 and 1993, working in the embassy there, you witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you say that we kind of misread Putin and misread his Russia. I mean, what was your feeling at the time with hindsight, and why did we misread things?
I think we misread things because I think we saw what had happened in Eastern Europe when the Warsaw Pact collapsed in countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and others. And I think we assumed that that was the sort of path of evolution that would come about once communism had been abandoned or had fallen. And I think that was one of the fundamental mistakes we made. Those of us that were inside the system, I think, were always conscious that unlike in Eastern Europe, there had never been really a reckoning with the excesses of communist rule in the Soviet Union. And the intelligence and security services were never properly reformed after 1991. And I think that was a sort of concern in the back of our minds, that as long as that remained the case, there was a risk of this kind of revanchism that we've seen now, where Russia is run effectively by the security services. Most of the top people in government, even people in business now, are sort of peers of Putin's from his time working in the KGB.
And if you rewind the clock back to that moment when you were in Moscow, I mean, what did you actually think at the time? You talk about the risks and the concerns you had. How optimistic were you at the time?
Well, there was genuine change. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that there wasn't. I mean, if you look at the way society was evolving in the early 90s in Russia, you had the emergence of a messy but definitely pluralist political system where elections were genuinely contested. And you also had effectively a pretty free press. I mean, I was very impressed with, when I was there, the development of the free press and reporting and investigative reporting and so on. But what you didn't have, which does seem to be the fundamental building block of a proper, mature democracy, was an independent, strong judiciary. And I think it's the lack of that in Russian evolution in the 1990s, which allowed there to be this revanchism, if you like, as I've said, to a more autocratic state. And even if you look at, for example, Trump in the United States now, it's interesting to note that neither the legislature nor the executive have been able or were able to bring him to book, but it's the judiciary which has. And I would argue that's further evidence that the fundamental building block of a mature democracy is an independent judiciary. And Russia's never had an independent judiciary.
What do you make of the recent, more hawkish stance taken by the French President Emmanuel Macron, who warns of the prospect of foreign ground troops being deployed to the war in Ukraine, and the British Foreign Secretary's assertion that Ukraine has a right, or had the right, to use weapons provided by Britain on targets inside Russia?
I think it's a development in relation to what's happening on the ground. I think for the first time in the last couple of months, certainly we've seen a prospect, not a likelihood, of the Ukrainian defence and the front line collapsing, and what the actual ramifications of that would be, which would be, I think, several million refugees coming into Europe, which would be horrendously difficult to finance and to manage, including politically. Um, so I think there's a realization, perhaps with Macron now, that actually one of Putin's key aims, and this is something I believe for as you know, for a long time, is to undermine and sort of destroy the EU itself. And by working through the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary and others, that is a real perceived threat now. And of course, Macron is looking strategically at the EU and France's influence and power within that body and seeing it being undermined.
What do you make of the fear of escalation that has been kind of warned against by so many leaders in this situation?
I mean, you're presumably talking about nuclear exchanges or the use of nuclear weapons, or even an attack on the Zaporizhia nuclear power station in that regard. And I think the issue there will be whether the Chinese, in fact, are restraining the Russians on all that. And I think they are. That's certainly what our understanding is. And that's somewhat reassuring. But, one of the problems in Russia is that the leadership lives in an increasingly small, isolated bubble. It's very clear throughout this war in Ukraine and the predecessing period that accurate information and policy advice was not passed up to the leadership. And that's a big problem in an autocratic system. And it means that it becomes somewhat unpredictable as to which path the country takes. And I think one of the things that's really been saving grace, if you like, is the fact that Russia's intent has never really been matched by its capabilities, either economic or military or political. And that's basically what saved us. I mean, China, in a way, is the opposite, has huge capabilities, but not as malign an intent. So I think that's how we have to look at Russia, and we have to realize that it's being run by a very small clique of people who are selected as a result of their loyalty to Putin rather than their competence, and that the transmission of information upwards and downwards is very difficult, and that's a problem.
And in response to those comments by the British Foreign Secretary, Russia has come back saying it could hit back at British military installations and equipment in Ukraine and elsewhere, and threatening in its southern military district to carry out exercises. How could the war in Ukraine escalate, not by design, but by accident?
Yeah, well, I've talked again about this before, that the war in Ukraine looks more to me like the First World War than the Second World War in that sense. And we all know that, events can sort of take on or accidental or small events like the Sarajevo assassination in that case, can kind of escalate very quickly and get out of control. And I think that's the risk here. It would be that effectively someone would make a mistake or miscalculate in an attack, and a missile would land on Poland, or a Romanian plane would be shot down or something like this, which could lead to exchanges at a higher level. I hope that doesn't happen. I think the Russians are being utterly reckless at the moment. Their jamming operations in the Baltic, for example, are very dangerous and could result in precisely this fear being realised.
With elections in the US, in the UK, and in many other countries this year, do you see any signs of Russia already meddling, trying to shape their outcomes?
Yes, I think the early signs are there, and I think that it will look different and feel different from what it was in 2020 and certainly in 2016. I think Russia's sort of got more savvy about this, and they will be using, for example, third country nationals in many cases to achieve their sort of objectives. I also think that things like the way in which the oil price is manipulated. Clearly, inflation is a big issue, particularly in America, as an election issue, effectively, between Biden and Trump. And if the Russians are able, through their sort of close relationships with the Saudis and the Iranians, the Venezuelans, to push the price of oil up over the summer, for example, and put a spurt of inflation into the American economy just before the election, that will play very badly for Biden. I suspect that that's the kind of thing we need to be looking out for.
What do you think President Putin would like to see in terms of the next US president?
I think he wants to see America weakened and isolationist fundamentally, and anyone, both in Congress and in the presidential campaign, that falls into that category would be welcome and worthy of support. Clearly, I think he would have a massive preference for Trump over Biden. But I think it's slightly more complicated than that because, of course, quite a lot of this decision-making in America that we've seen, and particularly with the aid package passage, for example, in Congress, doesn't actually depend on the president necessarily. It depends on other parts of the governmental structure. And so they'll be looking across the board at that. And they'll also be looking at who might get some of the key jobs, Defense Secretary, Treasury Secretary, whatever, Secretary of State, obviously, CIA chief, and looking at that, how that's going to play out under either scenario.
You recently said that the global geopolitical situation is more worrying to you right now than it has been in the whole of your 40-year career. What worries you the most?
What worries me the most, I think, well, several things. One, I don't think democracies, our Western democracies, have really woken up to the fact that we are living in a new era. We are no longer living in the post-communist era where we didn't have to spend a lot of money on security and defence and other things. And there's a sort of sense that there are still quite significant divisions. In Britain, what worries me is our relationship with Europe, and particularly the European Union, which is key to defending ourselves from incursions and instability directed at us by hostile states like Russia and China. So I think we are not particularly well led. I think that the states concerned have got their tails up. They're seeing an opportunity to fill a vacuum, not least in the global south, as it's called, where they are able to exert influence and point out things like so-called Western hypocrisy over Gaza and what have you. So I think that we are, for the first time, certainly in my career, on the back foot in the West. And I think that's very concerning.
And if you were at MI6 now on the Russia desk, what would be your priority?
I think it would really be to understand the dynamics inside Russia and the leadership, but also to look at what's actually happening in Russia. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in Russia which are kept quiet, which are not publicized. There was a figure issued, I think, came out the other week, which showed that the murder rate in Russia was up 900% in the last year. I mean, clearly the war is having a massive effect on the social fabric of Russia. Presumably thousands of troops coming back from the front lines in Ukraine, PTSD and everything else, all of which is being suppressed. Plus all the prisoners that have been let out of prison. Of course, virtually the whole young male Russian prison population has been let out to fight in Ukraine and then allowed to return to civilian life after 6 months. I mean, those are the sort of social experiments that I wouldn't like to be experiencing in our own country. And I really think that Russia is on a very steep slide, both culturally and socially and everything else. As we look at it today, I think that strategically and long term, Putin's current management of Russia is catastrophic for the country.
And he's just started his 5th term as president. What kind of future do you foresee for him?
I don't know about him. There are lots of rumours and information about his health and so on. There's a good degree of instability in the leadership just underneath him, where people are jockeying for the succession. One of the key Russian leaders, Igor Sechin, his son, died a couple of months ago in Moscow in very mysterious circumstances. Plus, you have a lot of the instability around the economy with people falling out of windows and people having heart attacks in their 50s and all the rest of it. So there's a good deal of instability just under the top leadership circuit. And I think the trend of Russia is to become a vassal state of China, effectively, both economically and politically, which is deeply unpopular amongst the Russian people for whatever reason. And military dependency on the likes of North Korea and Iran. I mean, this is not where your average Russian, even not particularly well-educated Russian, wants the country to be. Most Russians still want the country to be a European power and to have significant relationships with Europe, both economic and social, cultural.
You were based in Moscow at one of the more optimistic times for relations between Russia and the West. What hope can you offer for the future now?
Not much in the short term, I'm afraid. I mean, I think that if you look at Russian history, often where there's been a war that Russia's been involved in, and it's either lost or is perceived to have lost, then you get reform and regime change. And I think that has to be the hope, that eventually this war, there's a trigger point amongst the Russian people, and the regime changes, as it did after 1905 and it did in the 1850s after the defeat in the Crimean War. That's the sort of circle of Russian history, if you like. It's not a linear history like ours. It's much more of a circular history. So I think the hope is that Russia kind of burns itself out on the battleground in Ukraine, and that we see some kind of regime change leading to reform. But I'm certainly not saying that's inevitable or indeed probable, but it is possible.
Chris Steele, it's been good talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.